Hi, this is Matt McCormick. I'm in the Department of Philosophy at California State University, Sacramento. My email address is mccormick@csus.edu. And this is the next to last lecture in my Inductive Logic Phil 61 course on Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Today we're doing chapters 35 and 36, and we're to the end. We're actually to the culmination of all of Kahneman and Tversky's research with this theory about what he calls the two selves. And there's some really incredible, amazing research that comes out of this and some deep lessons for how can we how can we reason better about the way we make decisions. Okay, so Kahneman starts off with an abstract distinction. He says the word utility that we've been using is ambiguous, and we need to separate out two senses of what we mean. One of them might be what he calls experienced utility, which is just a measure of how much experienced pain or pleasure, going through some event gives you. So the actual feelings of pleasure and pain that you're having. So we've been doing expected value calculations with utilities, and we've been treating utility as the thing you want, the thing you desire. Well, there's actually a distinction we've got to draw out here, because there's the actual way you feel while you're having the experience. Maybe the root canal gives you pain, or maybe the ice cream and sundae makes you feel pleasure. So if we map that experience during the experience, we call that the experience utility. But there's this other thing that Kahneman calls the decision utility. And that, for lack of a better word, he calls wantability. How much value do rational agents who know their tastes, who know what they enjoy, who know what hurts, how much value do they put on something in their decisions? So the way you think about, the way you make decisions, predicting ahead of time, forecasting about what's going to make you happy when you put your money down, well, it turns out that sort of money value or utility value or decision value that you put onto some choice, it turns out to be different than the actual experienced utility that you have during the experience. And this opens up this big divide in Kahneman for something he calls the two selves. All right, so very important distinction. We're talking about the feelings you're actually having from moment to moment when you're going through an experience versus the way you assess the wantability of some experience. If you're on the front side making a decision, you're paying money for a vacation, or you're avoiding somebody because you don't want to talk to them, or you're making predictions or projections into the future, or assessing into the past, how desirable or wantable was that experience. So there's you in the moment, and then there's what you think will produce utility in the future, or what you think produced utility in the past. Okay, so there's a puzzle here that started bugging Kahneman early on in this research, and I'm going to raise it and not solve it for a bit. So let's look at the puzzle, and it'll start to bring out the distinction, the divide between these two. So suppose you're set up to get a painful injection every day for some set number of days. Would you, for example, be willing to pay some money to reduce the number of day injections from 6 to 4? You could reduce it by a third if you say pay $10 or $100 or $200. And there's probably some amount of money that you would pay for that to get it reduced by that much. Okay, now here's another question. So you probably would pay some amount of money to avoid the painful injection if you could. And the next question would be, well, how much would that be? You don't have to answer that question, but now consider this question. Suppose we were going to give you 20-day injections, and we offered to reduce it from 20 to 18. So again, we're going to reduce it by 2, but now the prospect is you're facing 20 of them. Would you pay to reduce it down to 18? And here, I think Kahneman's intuition, he didn't test this on anybody, but my intuition too, is that you wouldn't pay as much to reduce it from 20 to 18. Or you might not pay at all. You might just feel like, well, what's the difference between 18 and 20? I'm already going through it 18 times, 2 more, no big deal. Remember, diminishing marginal utility. So that works for pain as well as pleasure. So there's a puzzle here, because you would be willing to pay something to reduce from 6 to 4, which is 2, but you wouldn't be willing to pay, or you wouldn't pay as much to reduce from 20 to 18. So you've got the same phenomena that you're offering, you're getting the same exchange, but you're not willing to pay the same amount for it. And that's inconsistent. And on the classic model of econ rationality, the sort of Bernoulli style rationality we've been looking at, there's something wrong with that. There's something puzzling about that. That doesn't make sense. It shouldn't make sense. It's irrational in classic theory. However, when you sort of adopt Kahneman's revised view and you adopt his distinctions, suddenly this all makes some sense. Okay, so what's going on here? The second reduction in injections isn't worth as much to you, and we've got to figure out why. Okay, so here's another question, and this is actual research. So here's two patients getting a medical procedure, patient A and patient B, and this chart maps on the x-axis, or sorry, the y-axis, how much, the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is how much pain are they having. So patient A, the procedure lasts for almost 10 minutes, and it has these two spikes in pain. And patient B, the whole procedure lasts for 25 minutes and has a whole bunch of spikes. Okay, so one question I might ask you is, two patients are having the same procedure. A's procedure ends suddenly with the same peak as B. So the high point for A, the worst moment of pain for A, and the worst moment of pain for B is the same. So now right up front, I'm going to ask you a question. If we have to give you a medical procedure, which one of these do you want? Where that chart, that graph measures pain. And I think the really obvious answer when you look at it in the abstract like that, or if I asked you, your grandmother is in the hospital, we need to do a procedure on her, which one of these do you want to do? They're going to be equally effective at, solving whatever problem she's got. Well, if you love your grandmother, you're going to say, give her procedure A. Okay, so here's the remarkable thing. B's procedure ends after objectively much more pain. So which procedure would you choose? You might choose A in the abstract. But here's the amazing thing. Patient A, when we actually do this to people, so we have these different procedures, or we run these different procedures on people, and we have them rate their experience. So you have a bunch of people go through A, and you have a bunch of people go through B, where you're measuring their actual moment by moment experience, and you're getting a graph of how much pain they're going through. Patient A, after the procedure, will rate the experience as worse than B will rate it. So B is objectively undergoing way more pain, but given the way it unfolded for A will say, no, that was a much worse experience. That given the choice of actually enduring it or experiencing it, people actually prefer B over A, which seems like it's dead wrong. Okay, you might be doubtful about this. This is a very big study that did a lot of people. It's very well controlled, well-designed study, and they got this result that that Kahneman feels is robust. That the procedure A is worse in people's recollection or their assessment after the fact than procedure B. Okay, so what's going on there? What's happening? What is the explanation of this weird anomaly? Okay, so as a result, Kahneman gets these two really important principles. They're going to help us understand what makes us happy and what's messing up our judgments about our lives. So the first one's called the peak-end rule. So Tversky and Kahneman devised this peak-end rule, and here's what it says. It's kind of abstract. The global retrospective rating was well predicted by the average of the level of pain reported at the worst moment of the experience and its end. Now, another way to understand that is the subjects, their report of pain is an average of how bad it was at its peak and how bad it was at its end. So you take the last moment, you take the worst moment, and you average those together, and you get a number that predicts well how bad they say it would be. So what happens then is that for patient B, if you compare their peak moment and you compare their last moment, because it's tapering off, they come up with a lower average. They describe their experience because it's tapering off. I mean, think of it this way. You're enduring really extreme pain. It's spiking. It's its worst it's going to get. And then suddenly it stops. It stops abruptly. Okay, so what are you left with? You're left with a memory or an experience of this awful pain. That's patient A. Versus patient B goes through the same peak experience and has this awful moment, but then the experience slowly tapers off. So it's still painful, but it goes down and down and down and down. And it looks like what happens is that patient B remembers the reduction or the relief or the improvement in their state. And as a result, when you ask them to evaluate the experience afterwards, they go, oh, it wasn't as bad. They think it wasn't as bad compared to what patient A went through, which leads us to this principle. They are committing something that Kahneman calls duration neglect. Okay, now this is really remarkable. And this is one of the places where Kahneman just steps up and says that people are being irrational. The duration of the procedure seemed to have no effect whatsoever on the ratings of total pain. So here's this question I asked you at the outset: which one of these procedures would you prefer? But when people actually go through the experience and they evaluate it after the fact, they seem to just ignore how long it took. The duration of it doesn't seem to matter to them. They just commit this duration neglect mistake. All right, so get that in your head and think about it. We got some more plates to get spinning in the air here to understand. Okay, so Kahneman runs another experiment where they take a bunch of subjects, and what you do is you stick your hand in a bucket of cold water for some period of time, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, whatever. And then you take it out abruptly and wrap it in a warm towel. So you go from it's painfully cold to now it's comfortable and warm. Okay, so that's one thing that they did to some of the subjects in this experiment. And they took some other subjects and they did this to them: immerse their hand in the cold water for the same amount of time as in A, but then you add more time. You double the time or you half again the time, add 30 seconds with the temperature just a little less cold. So what they did is they added some warmer water. So it was a reduction. So they spend more time in the cold water, but it's less cold than it was. Then you take it out and wrap your hand in warm water or warm towel. Okay, so what they did here was they took some subjects and they had them rate from moment to moment during the experience, how bad is this? You know, like at the doctor where they've got the card that's got the happy faces down to the sad face. On a scale of 1 to 10, how bad are you feeling? So they had these subjects go through this experience and say, okay, this is getting painful, I'm at a 4. Okay, I'm at a 5. Okay, this is getting really unpleasant, I'm at a 7. And then the time was up for the period, and they pull out their hand and put it in a warm towel if you're in the A group. If you're in the B group, okay, this is getting bad, this is starting to hurt, I'm at a 7. Okay, this is starting to feel better, I'm at a 6. Okay, I'm at a 4. Okay, I'm at a 3. Okay, now take your hand out and put it in a warm towel. Okay, so you get the idea. Same sort of experience graph as what we saw with the pain study in the medical patients in the previous slide. Okay, so then ask these two different groups. Actually, sorry, they took the same people and they did both of those to them. So you had somebody going through A, it just took a few minutes, and then you had somebody going through B, and you sort of distributed this at random, and then you asked them, okay, so which one of these experiences would you prefer to do again? You know, maybe they offered to just give them some money or something. And it turns out that people showed a really pronounced preference for the B procedure. Subjects, I think it was something like 80% of the subjects actually preferred the B procedure, even though there's objectively more pain going on during that procedure. Okay, so it's another robust experimental empirical result that seems to prove or corroborate what we saw in the pain study, and seems to corroborate it was consistent with the results of the peak end rule and the duration neglect rule. Okay, so something's going on here where people do a weird kind of calculation about how much pain they're going through, where it seems to depend on the peak and the end, and they average it. And they also seem to commit this duration neglect mistake. Okay, so and Kahneman points out that this is actually like something we've seen before in the book. He says this is the less is more effect that we saw before, the same as when we saw with chipped plates and whole plates in the garage sale, and people will give a worse average cost or price for the set that's got both kinds of plates in it than they will for just the good plates. This is going way back in the book, but this is a if you search through Kahneman's book for the less is more effect, we've seen this before. And what's happening is that system one, which makes these fast judgments, is using averages or norms or prototypes, but it doesn't do summing. It doesn't calculate the mathematical area under the curve and come up with this answer to you and your intuitions that says, oh, this experience was on the whole had more duration of pain than this one. It doesn't keep that kind of calculus about the area under the curve in your pain experiences or your pleasure experiences. It just grabs these snapshots, these slices of how bad did it get and how did it end, and then it slaps together an answer and tells you, okay, that was awful. I don't want that to happen again. And then when the more tapering experience happens to you, you end up remembering. It grabs a snapshot, it grabs a prototype out of that and says, oh, what I remember from that experience was that it tapered off, it got better. So there was relief, and I associate that feeling of relief with that experience. So I end up preferring that kind of experience. So given the way your equipment is built, it starts making more sense why you might make your decisions or show your preferences that way. Okay, so it turns out that duration neglect and the peak-end rule apply to pleasure too. With rats and with humans, we favor intensity over duration. So with pleasures, we like them short and spiky and really intense, and we don't seem to care so much about longer, moderate pleasures. Given the choice between, and this is a picture of a famous experiment where they did something really kind of troubling with these rats. It's called wireheading. They set this rat up so he could press the button to sort of give an electrical stimulation to these pleasure centers in his own brain. That's actually not the study that showed the thesis on this slide, but it's a famous piece of psychological research. Okay, so the big point here is that duration neglect and peak end rule both seem to apply to both pleasure and pain, that we have these weird biases with regard to evaluating our experience over time. Okay, so that creates a real puzzle here, and the way Kahneman puts it actually is that the predictions or the results of what's rational are actually in conflict with the way we evolved biologically. Kahneman says a cornerstone of the classic econ model, the rational agent model of agency that we've been using all semester long, is that humans have consistent preferences and they know how to maximize those, and we need to leverage, and then in economic models we let them go in the markets and they pay what they think an object is worth, and then they get it in exchange and so on, right? So that's the cornerstone of the classic economic behavioral theory. But biology built us a very different way. We evolved to have this weird irrational preference for intensity over duration, is the short way to put it, with regard to pleasures and pains. We just seem to ignore how long pleasures and pains last. That doesn't seem to matter to us, but objectively it should. Rationally, you want the pain to be brief. If I gave you the choice of those two procedures, you'd go, well, obviously I want the procedure where there's half as much pain. I don't want the one that keeps dragging on, but actually in experience, you prefer that. But if you, like I said, when I asked my question about which one would you prefer to your grandmother, and the same thing rationally, it makes sense to say that you want pleasures to be enduring. You want pain to be over quick, and you want pleasures to last for a long time. But it turns out that we neglect those, we ignore that. Memory is the culprit here. It's this judging, assessing self that sums up and looks at the experience after the fact, but memory has evolved to neglect duration and average peaks and ends. Okay, so this leads Kahneman to posit the two selves. You're actually kind of at war with yourself. There's a remembering self that summarizes, that goes back and remembers the experience afterwards. And when I ask you, for example, hey, how are you? I haven't seen you in a while. How have things been? Okay, I ask you that question. What do? Well, you're going to have a sort of high level of abstract retrospection at that level when I ask you, and you're going to sort of summarize your own life like you do on Facebook or Instagram or on social media. You're going to project an image, right? And this picture from this collection of Instagram pictures is making fun of people going out and putting themselves in these beautiful environments and then taking the same picture of themselves and posting it on Instagram so that they look like they're having a great time. Okay, when I ask you, hey, how are you doing? The remembering self spins the story a certain way. You'll recall certain events when you'll put different emphases on those events, and you'll have a different perspective than actually the way they happened when you were there. So the picture of the woman in the meadow looking at the cliff, it looks fantastic. It's fuzzy light. It looks great. Her hair is beautiful and all that. But what you're not noticing is what she's not remembering, or she doesn't want you to remember, is all the details about how she got there, or the fight she had with the boyfriend just before it, or when she was yelling at him to get the camera right or take the picture the better way. The remembering account after the fact is very different than the actual moment by moment experience we're having. In fact, I was vacationing on a beach, and it was a beautiful beach, and we spent all afternoon sort of sitting on the beach and just hanging out, and there was a steady stream of women and their boyfriends or husbands who would come down to the beach, and there was a particular spot on the corner of the beach that was especially photogenic, and every one of them would stop there. She'd flip her hair and pose and have the boyfriend take pictures. Maybe she'd take a few more pictures, and then they'd turn around and leave because they're constructing this image or portraying themselves on Instagram as doing this thing, right? Okay, so that's to be contrasted with the experiencing self. And that's the person who's actually having the feelings in the moment. The moment-to-moment experience of pain, pleasure, contentment, resentment, jealousy, happiness, or whatever you're actually going through when you're in the moment. Okay, so here's a rather chilling implication in Kahneman's next chapter about what happens with duration neglect. It turns out that we apply or we commit the duration neglect problem when we evaluate whole lives. That is, when we look at our whole life, my whole life, or I look at somebody else's life, I do the same mistake. So here's some evidence, or here's some of his empirical, here's a summary of his empirical research that seems to show that conclusion. Okay, so imagine this woman. Jen was extremely happy through her whole life. She enjoyed her work, she took vacations, she spent time with friends and on her hobbies, and she dies, let's say, suddenly and relatively painlessly at 60. Okay, so there's a person's life. What do you think of that life? Okay, here's another person's life. Jen was extremely happy throughout her whole life, enjoyed her work, taking vacations, spent time with her friends until she was 60, just like the first woman. Then she had 5 more years. But these years were just pleasant. They weren't quite as good, not nearly as happy before. And then she dies the same way at age 65. Okay, so question, which life is better? And the amazing thing here is that when you do single evaluations, okay, so you give test subjects just A or just B, and then you give them a scale on which to measure the quality or the desirability of these people's lives, people actually rate A's life, Gen A's life, as better. They think Gen 60's got a better life than Gen 65, even though the Gen 65 had 5 more years that maybe weren't as great as the first 60, but they were 5 more years, and they weren't in pain. But that having everything be extremely happy and then ending suddenly, there's a duration neglect going on here. All right, now it gets worse. This gets much worse. If one human subject evaluates Jen and another evaluates Sue, what will happen here? So look at this case. Jen was extremely happy throughout her life. She enjoyed her work. She took vacations. She spent time with friends and on her hobbies. And then she dies at 60. Okay, so that is, you do have a single evaluation on Jen, or you have somebody else evaluate Sue. How good was Sue's life? Sue was extremely happy throughout her life. She enjoyed her work, taking vacations, spending time with her friends and on her hobbies. And then she died suddenly at age 30. Okay, so the remarkable thing here is that people will rate these two lives as having the same desirability. Not in joint evaluation like you're doing right now. So you're looking at both of them, and you can see that Jen's life was twice as long as Sue's life. But if we give those to people singly and they look at them, they go, yeah, those are both great lives. I give them both a 9. Okay, so there's an amazing level of duration neglect going on here. That is, they just evaluated somebody's life as equivalent to somebody who had the very same life for twice as long. They just ignored or neglected doubling this person's lifespan, doubling their happiness, doubling their pleasure. Made no difference in their evaluation. So that's a really remarkable result. And here's one of the cases where Kahneman's willing to say, okay, your system is running you off the rails. Your system is messing with your decisions if it's giving you those kinds of outputs. Okay, so what the fuck is going on here? We commit duration neglect and peak end effect when we evaluate whole lives, says Kahneman. The peak end rule, again, is that we tend to average even short periods of suffering with longer periods of pleasure and happiness for a lower total assessment of the quality of life. So 60 happy years plus 5 less pleasant years is evaluated as less desirable than just 60 happy years, even though objectively those 5 extra years are better, or they add something to the life. And then with duration neglect, doubling the duration of happiness in a person's life had no impact of people's overall evaluation of the quality or desirability of that life. Okay, so that's your system giving you some screwy results. And that means that when you're thinking about your life, when you're making plans about what you're going to do next, or what kind of life you will live in the future, or what kind of life you lived in the past, and when you look at other people's lives, your system is betraying you. It's giving you some contrary to reason results that you ought to correct for. And this is really why this is at the end of the book, and this is Kahneman's big punchline for the book. We're making poor judgments about the quality and duration of our lives and of others, and we're making poor plans as a result. Okay, so here's some other examples that draw out this conflict between the experiencing self and the remembering self. So imagine I'm going to give you these two choices, a weird science fiction choice. It's kind of a spin on one of Kahneman's examples. Okay, so for $1,500, which is a pretty good deal, I will give you a fabulous all-inclusive vacation to the Maldives, and you get to have parasailing and abundant food cooked by world-class chefs and unlimited cocktails and all-night parties, and you get to carouse with celebrities. So it's an awesome deal, right? Okay, so here's another one. For $150, I'll give you the very same vacation. You get to have all of those fabulous experiences. But at the end, we're going to give you a pill, and it's going to erase all your memories of everything that you experienced. There'll be no pictures and no video and no memories. So you'll wake up back at the airport, back in San Francisco or wherever, and you won't remember anything about the last week. Although you just had the very same experience as the person who paid $1,500 for the first vacation. Okay, so would you do it? Is the question. Are you willing to do that for $150? You probably paused, at least thought about it. You might even say, no, I won't even do that for $150. But that's a killer deal to go to the Maldives for a week. Like, that's just an awesome deal. But you might see that loss of memory, loss of getting to have those experiences accessed for the rest of your life as a really big loss, like more, worth more than $1,350 here. Like, given this choice, I'd rather pay $1,500 and get the added bonus of all the remembering self experience in addition to what the things I went through at the time. And Kahneman's point here is that the remembering self does the choosing about vacations. And he points out that there's in the tourist industry, there's actually two different industries. Wherever you go someplace famous for a vacation, there's two, or different places to go vacation, there's two things happening. You can either go there to create memories for your remembering self. So there's photo ops and there's tours to go see the big landmarks, and there's all these special events for people to take pictures, right? Get out of the bus, take a picture, get back on the bus and leave. So you've made a memory. You've locked it down. But there's a whole nother industry of vacations where the point is to go give you a good experience. We'll just do an all-inclusive experience on the beach, and we'll give you food and drink. And it won't include especially going to lots of these photo ops, or going to see, pyramids, or going to see fabulous ruins, Aztec ruins or something. It won't include any of that memory stuff. It's more about just you going and having a good quality time during the experience. So there's two different industries here that satisfy two different selves, but it turns out that's the same you. That's the same self in one body. But all too often, the remembering self does the choosing about which vacation you're going to go on. Okay, so here's our summary for chapters 35 through 36. We've gotten an account now from Kahneman of two selves, the experiencing self versus the remembering self. And he has explained this phenomena of duration neglect and how it's skewing our choices, and peak end rule, which is also leading us to evaluate our experiences in a strange way instead of actually taking account of the actual quantity of pleasure and pain that we have. And Kahneman's not shy about saying that we mistakenly evaluate whole lives by duration neglect and the peak end rule, but the length and quantity of your pleasures and your life should matter. All right, so that's it for chapters 35 through 36.